Good afternoon. My name is Monica Ramirez, and I am the founder and president of Justice for Migrant Women. And it is my honor and privilege to be in conversation with some real powerhouses who are making change across our country. We are here for a conversation about rural women across our country. And these incredible individuals are part of a special fellowship that we have that's focused on rural women's leadership. So thank you so much for tuning in. We are excited to have this conversation, and I am so pleased to be joined by Jessica Helen Lopez, Andrea Duarte Alonso, Martha Sonato, and Ashley Woodard Henderson. So hey everybody, thank you so much for being part of this conversation.
Hey Monica, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, are we ready to dig in?
Gracias. Yes, let's do it.
So excited. Okay, so for those of you who are just learning a little bit more about the work that we are doing, I want to give you some context for this conversation. So first, it's important for you to know about the Rural Women's Collective Fellowship. This program was created to bring together powerful voices like these incredible leaders who are with us today, because they have compelling ideas and they represent rural women and girls across our country. This fellowship focuses on elevating the leadership of women of color and other underrepresented community members. As a part of this fellowship, we had the opportunity to look for individuals who wanted to help achieve the mission of elevating rural women's voices, and that is how we were able to find these incredible folks who are part of the fellowship. And I want to share with you some about their backgrounds. You need to know who they are, you need to know their bios, and you need to remember their names because they are trailblazing. So if you don't mind, y'all, I'm going to read your bios just so people can know a little bit more about you. Is that okay? All right. So Jessica Helen Lopez is the city of Albuquerque's Poet Laureate Emeritus. She was the Poet Laureate from 2014 to 2016. She's the author of 4 poetry collections, and she has a 5th forthcoming book to be published by the University of New Mexico Press. She's the Communications Outreach and Community Support Lead with NACA Inspired Schools Network and teaches poetry at the Native American Community Academy and the UNM Chicana and Chicano Studies Department. Jessica Helen Lopez is a Chicana mestiza from Paramount, California, and the Borderlands U.S. Frontera of Deming, New Mexico. She's a mother to a UNM freshman of engineering and architecture department. So welcome to this conversation, Jessica. We have Andrea Duarte Alonso, who is with us, and she is the lead for America Hometowns Fellow, working with Southwest Initiative Foundation and the Immigrant Law Center in her home community of Worthington, Minnesota. She identifies as a Mexican-American Latina, a first-generation college graduate, and a homecomer, someone who has returned to their hometown community to work and live. We have that in common. Andrea grew up across the Midwest in small-town meatpacking plant communities. Through her lived experiences in these communities, she's motivated to work in public service to amplify rural immigrant voices and demonstrate the diversity of rural America. She's an advocate for various social justice issues, a writer, an oral historian, and an aspiring immigration attorney and policymaker. Martha is the political director at PECUN, Oregon's farm worker union. Martha has worked in Governor Kate Brown's office as a Housing and Human Services policy assistant and as a legislative aide in Senator Gessler's office. In 2016, Martha joined PECUN and led successful, robust candidate and issue campaigns in the Latinx community, from running a parallel campaign to elect the first Indigenous immigrant woman to House District 22, to passing a $620 million bond for Salem Kaiser schools. In January 2019, Martha became the political director at PECUN and led the Oregon Voting Rights Act Coalition, successfully passing a Voting Rights Act in June 2019. She is passionate about building a representative democracy and passing equitable policies that are grounded and focused on those who are most impacted. In 2015, Martha graduated from Willamette University. She's the daughter of farm workers from Hood River, Oregon. And Ashley Woodard Henderson, my friend, is co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center, which serves as a catalyst for grassroots organizing and movement building in Appalachia and the South. They work with people fighting for justice, equality, and sustainability, supporting their efforts to take collective action to shape their own destiny. Through popular education, language justice, participatory research, cultural work, and intergenerational organizing, they help create spaces at Highlander and in local communities where people gain knowledge, hope, and courage, expanding their ideas of what is possible. Ashley is a longtime activist and community organizer working to win environmental justice in Central and Southern Appalachia and a multitude of issues, including labor, reproductive health and rights, ending anti-Black racism and police brutality, and more across the US South. She's an active participant in the movement for Black lives, and she's also on the governance council of the Southern Movement Assembly. So we have a powerhouse group with us, and I thank you so much for your time. So let's just jump right in. For those of you who maybe are not that familiar with rural America, we want to break it down for you. There are more than 19 million women who live in rural America. Most rural and migrant women in the United States live in poverty, face persistent inequality, and lack the services and protections that they need to live healthy and whole lives. Political leaders often speak about rural America, but seldom have they actually been to rural America. They haven't been to our communities, but they talk about what they think we need and what they want without ever consulting us. So that is how the decisions are made that impact our lives without having any real input from us. Their perception of rural America is white and monolithic, with blanket solutions that are offered that don't fix the complex issues that impact our communities. In reality, rural America is comprised of individuals of many diverse backgrounds, including Latinas, Indigenous, and Native, Black, and Asian women, and women of other races and ethnicities. Yet few women are actually, especially women of color, are actually elected to hold positions of power in their communities or appointed to leadership positions in rural communities. This has resulted in the overall lack of civic participation and political power in rural America, particularly for rural women of color. So this is the reality, and we are set on changing it. And that's part of the reason we're having this conversation. So let me kick it off with our first question. And this is for all of you. How do we ensure that we actually change the perception of who is rural America? How do we make sure that rural America is accurately portrayed and represented in the media, in our communities, and in politics? Ashley, do you want to kick us off?
So excited to be here with sisters whose work I so respect and feel like literally saves my life on the daily basis. Being in this cohort with you all has been incredible. And Monica, like, you just continue to be a living embodiment of the answer to this question. So just to kick it off, I want to be clear that part of the reality of folks understanding rural America, particularly as it impacts marginalized and targeted communities in rural America, right? Those of us that live on the margins of that margin, folks that are queer, LGBTQI, folks that are Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian American, folks that are Latinx, folks that are undocumented, folks that are disabled, folks that are working class or cash poor, et cetera, right? The work is not only for us to be willing to stand up and tell our stories, which quite frankly does not come without consequences. Mm-hmm. The even more important piece is for folks to be open to actually listening to us tell the truth about our story, right? I think that all too often when people hear about particularly women of color in rural America, to Monica's point, they don't believe we exist. And once they do, they see us as like, all these poor folks that are impacted by capitalism and poverty, white supremacy, white nationalism, paramilitary forces, and violence. They see us connected to, like, you know, being the survivors of patriarchal violence, et cetera. All the systems that harm, but what they don't necessarily center is our stories of resistance and resilience that are as old as our people are, right? That actually, it's been those of us on the margins in rural America that have sometimes been the tip of the spear in terms of the fight to save the semblances of democracy in this country, right? That it's been women in rural America that pushed the labor movement, that built up progressive and leftist movements in this country, that it's literally been rural women who were the solution to some of the problems that our country faced, not just the survivors of the problems. So I guess if I was saying, how do we move from just the narrative interventions to the change, it would be, we are still in the process of decoding to a broader population what rural America actually is in practice, not just an identity, right? The identity matters to me, but the actual praxis of what it means to be a rural woman is something that I think this country needs to learn, that the camera should be pointed at us to find solutions, not just to interrogate problems.
I appreciate that so much. And I see all of us are like nodding our heads. Yes, yes, yes. And Martha, you've spent so much of your time working really on this question of representation and in politics. And so from your vantage point and building on what Ashley shared, why does this matter?
So like Ashley, very honored to be in this space with such strong women as you all are, and you all are an inspiration to me. And yes, to everything that Ashley has been sharing, I think it has an impact in our everyday lives, right? And our communities' everyday lives and decisions that are made about our lives. So anything from healthcare to education to workers' rights, it's embedded in our communities. And so I feel very passionate about rural Oregon, which is where I'm located. I grew up in rural Oregon and have lived most of my life in rural Oregon. And time again, I see how in a lot of these political spaces, we often talk about rural America as if there aren't any BIPOC communities in these spaces. And the true reality is that our demographics have drastically changed, and we're not talking about that. And it's not only about making sure that we're acknowledging the changes in demographic and that we are talking about that on everything from legislative campaigns to electoral organizing to communications campaigns, but to ensure that we are actually investing money, infrastructure in building up the leadership of these communities, these local community members on a lot of these areas that I mentioned, right? Political organizing, political campaigns, advocacy. So it's not only, making sure that we're really highlighting that change in our different communities and making sure that all of our messaging is acknowledging that change, but also that we are investing in the infrastructure, in the leadership. This is a real opportunity for a lot of foundations, right, to be able to invest in a lot of these rural communities that have made so many huge changes in our communities over the decades, and are heavily under-resourced. And so we got to make sure that they have the actual resources to be able to participate in a lot of these political processes that, once again, have a real impact on our everyday lives.
I appreciate that because, Ashley talked about the marginalized of the marginalized, and in many ways we represent the marginalized of the marginalized, and our communities have never been invested in adequately enough. And that is part of the reason why we have so many of the problems that we see in our communities. But, as we've been doing this work over the last couple of years, really building this rural civic engagement project focused on rural women's leadership, one of the things I've been struck by is that when I talk to people about it, including funders, Martha, it's like they think we just discovered it. Like it's new, like we just all of a sudden showed up in these communities, and we know that's not true. And Jessica, I'd love for you to speak to this because, the Native community in our country was here before all of us. We've always been in these communities. And so could you just speak to this a little bit about the history behind our presence in these communities and why we need funders and political leaders and others to understand that we didn't just arrive.
Gracias, Mónica. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here, and thank you so much to mis hermanas that are on this panel now and that did all of the work to bring this fellowship together. I'm just absolutely honored. I can't speak on behalf of folks who identify as Native American / indigenous here in Nuevo Mexico. Soy chicana, soy mestiza. However, for the last decade now, I've been working with the Native American Community Academy, and we represent 61 plus tribal affiliations, not just here from the land of Nuevo Mexico, but across Indian country. And the work that I do with NISN, which is an indigenous network of schools outside of NM and going into South Dakota, our Ute relatives from Colorado, California, rural and urban settings. What I have experienced working through community support and engaging in storytelling is that to activate or to continue to activate and assist and advocate for our sisters of rural communities is to engage with them in storytelling that is their story and us not telling their story for them, because they have been here for time immemorial, so that can be as simple as a land acknowledgement. So here right now, I'm sitting in my room in this virtual plática with everybody, but my land acknowledgement begins with us stating that here I sit talking on Tiwa land. Right. And to acknowledge that is just one of the many first steps that, folks can do to honor, our communities, especially those rural, pueblo, reservation, frontera communities. Especially this last presidential election, I learned lots from a bevy of grassroots organizations that came together to form powerful coalitions to make sure that we were helping to continue to activate voting power among rural women or women that were coming into registering to vote, but also oftentimes our matriarch. Because that's where all the true cultura and family and love and advocacy lies. It's in the traditions, the stories, the song, the dance of our people, our indigenous relatives and our BIPOC communities. And so I think it's a matter, again, of helping to create, sustain safe places, inclusive intersectional spaces to tell stories and share testimonials, but also to elevate those stories into action. And what does that action look like? It varies. It's different per community. It shouldn't always be cookie cutter. For, maybe let's say the Navajo reservation, that's not going to look the same for maybe the Jemez people here in New Mexico, and won't look the same as our relatives in Las Cruces, that's near Juarez or El Paso, or Deming, where I come from, which is near Palomas. Those needs and wants are going to be different, and the way they activate their power are going to be different. But when I think about rural women, man, I really champion, the women of the Navajo Nation who really helped to turn Arizona red. And I know that we're going to get to that point and talk about our projects as far as what we want to write about and celebrate. But right there is just a very, very transparent, pragmatic way in which power is being flipped and switched, and activated among our BIPOC rural women communities. The power of testimonio and story, and then platforming off of that into enacting advocating for policies and legislation and running for positions to make things happen.
I'm feeling charged up already. I don't know. We're just barely starting this conversation, but I think that there is so much to be said for the stories we tell. But there also is a place to think about where our stories are heard and how they're heard and who's receiving them. So I appreciate you bringing in the importance of the power of storytelling. Andrea, I want to go to you and talk a little bit about new communities and places, in BIPOC folks in places where people don't expect us. I come from rural Ohio. People don't expect, when I tell them I'm from Ohio, they get so confused. They think, they ask me if I'm from Idaho or other states, they get really confused. And you're from one of those states where there's an emerging BIPOC community in some of these small towns in Minnesota. So talk a little bit about your experience, arriving in Minnesota, and why you think how this new energy is helping to reshape and, quite frankly, reinvigorate some of these small communities across our country, including yours.
Thank you, Monica. And I'm so excited that we're having this conversation. It's not every day that we get to talk to rural women and tell folks about our stories and our experiences. And so, yeah, Minnesota, obviously it's been in the news a lot for good and bad. I think the Black Lives Matter movement and what happened with the murder of George Floyd really elevated our state and the variety of different kind of stories. And definitely a very dominantly white state, which, many in the nation probably continue to see that, especially outside of the Twin Cities area. They probably believe that most of the majority of BIPOC folk are within there because of the stories they're hearing of the Black Lives Matter protests and all of that. In reality, those BLM protests also happen in solidarity across the state of Minnesota, even in communities that might be majority white. What's really cool and different about my experience, and unique, I'd say unique more than different. In Worthington, we are, I believe, we're considered a minority majority community per capita in the state of Minnesota, which literally means that our minority communities are the majority. That means when you're entering into our school system, over 60% of those students are students of color. Yet when you see our school board, it's completely white, male dominated. When you look at our leadership, it's still very much white. So of course, if you're talking and telling these stories, you're gonna hear the narrative of a white leader who's talking about BIPOC community members, and you're not really uplifting that narrative. And I think that's why it's so powerful that in this fellowship we're getting taught ourselves, people who are living in close proximity, to really unique perspectives to be able to uplift these stories, because at the end of the day, we're the best ones to tell that story. And yeah, it's super unique to be able, I feel like my experience is so awesome, and I want to continue to uplift it and everything. And I want to go back a little bit to how can we accurately portray them, our stories in rural women. Journalists are always going to be coming into our communities and telling our story, but it's really important that we tell our community members that they are also capable of writing their own story.
Thank you, Andrea. And you're leading me perfectly into my next question, which is, so we created this fellowship. We know that across rural America, many of the newspapers and other media outlets are actually closing. And there are information deserts in our communities, and people are telling our stories, whether they're from our communities or not. And so this fellowship aims to try to ensure that rural women's voices are being heard through the media and different mediums. What drew you to this fellowship? And I want to hear what you're writing about. What are the topics that you're writing about?
Again, not to even be flippant, but seriously, I think so many of us were drawn to this fellowship because of who was calling us together. Like, just want to be real frank, that Monica and the work of this organization to build a space where rural women can not only come together to share story and talk about strategic and tactical interventions that we're making in our work, but also just have some space to actually develop our leadership together, to learn new things from each other, to share our stories even internally, and to be able to build that kind of like relational infrastructure, I think is critical. And what drew me in particular to this is I was looking for my folks, and I found them through this fellowship. And so, yeah, I think that's part of it. Stuff that, I'm particularly thinking about writing is like, one is the South is the largest geographic region in the United States, where the highest concentration of Black people live, where the majority of LGBTQI plus folks live. And obviously the story of the rural South is particular to the conversations about democracy, past, present, and future in the United States. And I don't want to be US essentialist. Like the Southern Freedom Movement that was led in no small part by rural women has always, for as long as it's existed, had international implications, right? Fighting back against colonialism of our people across our diasporic realities. And so some of my writing has just been an attempt to make sense of that for folks that don't live in it every day. Recognizing that like the hour podcast or the hour webinar or the one article is minutes of my 35-year lived experience and my ancestors' centuries of storytelling, right? So that's part of it. I think that there's also just some real political caution that I've gotten to think through and write about through this fellowship, right? That the making meaning of this moment and relationship to the past and projection about the future feels really critical to social movements of all stripes across the country, being able to make the right tactical interventions. So reminding people that like January 6th wasn't the first time white supremacists had like attempted coups, right? Like that reminding people that Reconstruction in this moment actually do have a lot in common, both in terms of building Black independent political power, which in this contemporary context also then built like this Black multiracial, multi-class, multi-sector movement that also had like badass Latinx and Indigenous and Asian American folks throwing down in power building ways in their own communities too. That's part of the story. But the other part of that story is that after Reconstruction, this country saw 10 years of the worst lynchings we've ever experienced. This work doesn't happen without blowback. And why does that matter? It matters because of what Martha and Monica said, because we need to make sure that these folks are protected, that they're resourced to not only sustain the work they're doing, but also to recover from that backlash. And it matters for what Jessica and Andreas said around the importance of culture and us being able to tell our stories in our own voices, regardless of all the other eyes that might be on us, especially when it only gets them more credibility and proximity to us, whether it's our suffering or our victories, quite frankly, right? It's like what we saw. Part of the first piece that I was writing for this fellowship was just being really, really angry that in the electoral cycle for the presidential election, we saw people really care about what was happening in the rural South, that we were the best. We were the people that needed to be courted. We were the ones that were going to save democracy, right? We did that with the presidential election. We did it again with the Senate in Georgia, at least Georgia, right? And then we did it again in our municipal elections. But January 6th happens, and then all of a sudden, the only story that can be told is not about how we've built power that saved democracy from fascism and authoritarianism, but actually that all that you can talk about the rural American South in particular is white supremacy, patriarchal violence, the hillbillies, out here making trouble for the rest of the progressive United States when white supremacy exists everywhere. That's been making meaning of some of that, and doing it from a rural perspective is some of what I've been focusing on.
Yeah, we actually had this conversation within our team about sort of the way that there's a lot of typecasting happens in our country, right? And when typecasting happens, there are so many dangers, and people in the rural South in particularly have been typecast and continue to be typecast. So I am grateful to you for bringing in our ancestors, one, and for challenging the ways by which our communities have been typecast and erased. And, all of you are doing that. All of you are challenging these myths about our communities and lifting up the strength of our past and the people who've influenced it. And so we're appreciative of you for the ways that you're doing that, and excited about what you're writing about and thinking about and understanding how you're seeding change. So let's hear some more about what brought you here and where you're going with it through this fellowship. Jessica, do you want to go next?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. So I'm thinking about, busting those myths and those stereotypes, these kind of oppressive boxes that rural women are squished into, and when I think of that, I think of taking this opportunity to uplift Wilhelmina Yazi, who was the impetus and the inspiration behind what I wanted to write about for this fellowship. She hails from Gallup, New Mexico, which is the northwestern region, rural America near Shiprock, near the New Mexican Navajo Nation, and had enough with the educational system here in New Mexico, as is the case across the country, that just wasn't supporting her son. There was a lot of inequity. There's still a lot of inequity. And so she sued the state of New Mexico and the educational department and won. And it was her and several school districts, as well as a Mexican-American family that was represented by MALDEF, which is the Mexican-American Legal Defense Organization, as well as New Mexico Center on Law and Poverty here. And it was found that our young people, our indigenous, our Spanish speaking, our brown, our Black, our Asian, our POC students, constitutional rights were being violated, and they were not being provided adequate, efficient education for decades. And things needed to be changed. Because of that, because of her willingness to, rise in her power, to activate her community, to demand the changes and the support that she needed on behalf of her son, but for all young people here in New Mexico, we are now moving towards a more equitable educational system in which we are gaining momentum per school districts and charter schools and community members, in which now equity councils that are comprised of our elders, of our youth, are now in essentially mandatory across the school to inform these schools what our young people are in need of. We are needing our accurate histories to be reflected in our curriculum. We are needing our schools to be able to meet the needs of all differently abled students, for ELL students, just curriculum that is relevant to our cultural backgrounds, that we enact every day. And that's what Wilhelmina did. And because of that, I was really inspired by her story, and really inspired by writing about and focusing on all those grassroots movements that are happening within our communities, in which we're rising in our power, and we are being able to work with other community members as well, because I feel like our liberation is definitely tied into our solidarity. And so this fellowship has given me that opportunity to really sit and meditate on those instances of our power, and not just taking back our power, but working with the power that we've always had as rural women, as indigenous, as BIPOC rural women. And so it also craft-wise, allowed me to, work with the sisters of this fellowship and the folks that are being brought in with their areas of expertise, just to think about how I do that logistically, and for that, most appreciative of, because it allows me to expand my skill set.
Thank you. And Jessica, thank you for bringing into the room all of the other folks who are making this fellowship possible. I want to make sure that we give a big shout out to Norma Flores Lopez from our team, who has really been the heart and the engine behind this fellowship and this project, and Anne Ream, who's been in community with you, having some of these conversations about the craft and how we can best get our stories told. And certainly want to give huge shout out and much love to Prism and their team for being in partnership with us on this project. Martha, you spend a lot of time thinking about building power and helping to exercise our power, and kind of moving from what Jessica was saying, like there is not always this recognition for the fact that we're not just gaining power, we've always had it. And maybe perhaps for the first time other people are realizing it, but it's always been there. Tell us a little bit about what you're writing and how you're bringing your work into it, and what drew you to this fellowship.
When I first read the description of the fellowship, everything spoke to me. I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. And I was so excited. And I think it's a really nice feeling to have, because it's been a while since I've done fellowships, and to see one that really spoke to my heart was just really exciting. So I'm once again very excited to be part of this space with you all. So for the past 5 years, advocated professionally on the professional level with my organization for farm worker rights. And I feel very passionate about farm worker rights because I am the daughter of farm workers that still do this work in one of the most beautiful agricultural areas in Oregon, which is the Columbia River Gorge. And it has been the honor and privilege of my 28 years to be able to advocate for my parents and for a lot of folks in my community. And I was really shocked. I think it was 2 years ago when I learned that about the really racist history that has to do with overtime pay for farm workers. And I think it was really eye-opening. And it was eye-opening in the sense of, wow, we have so many connections across our different communities and we don't even know about them, right? That there's so much history that ties our different communities, and there's so much work that we can do to continue, bringing bringing that to the forefront and making sure that we're talking about that and within our own communities. So I was shocked that in the 1938, President Franklin Roosevelt intentionally excluded millions of Black farm workers who sustained Southern agriculture at poverty wages from receiving basic labor rights, such as overtime pay. And it was extremely wrong then, and it is extremely wrong now. Today, most of the farm workers are Latinos, right, from Latin America, Central America, and that exclusion still continues. And so we must right that wrong that has, like I said, that was is rooted on slavery and on a racist system. And so when I found that out, I was like, whoa, we literally, our liberations are tied to each other with the Black community, right? And I think in the Latino community, we don't really talk about our shared histories, right? Of like, wow, a lot of our community members are farm workers, but actually, a lot of the farm workers back in 1938 were Black, and they also like suffered extreme, horrible working conditions. And we see a lot of those remnants of those systems still today. And so that's what I want to write about, because a lot of states, not a lot of states, a lot more states should be passing overtime pay for farm workers. But currently only about 5 have a law like that. And so here in Oregon, our organization actually introduced a policy to extend overtime pay to farm workers. And we just had our first hearing actually on Monday. And it was extremely, extremely shameful to hear the opposition's arguments, right? A lot of it rooted on, this is going to bring us so many economic burdens, and we can't do this, as if farm workers are second-class workers. And a lot of the legislators that call themselves progressives and Democrats, some of them are actually in opposition to this policy as well. And so it makes me extremely, I think, angry when I hear people, I support farm workers and I support overtime pay, but, and there's always that but, right? So what does it really mean that you support the concept, but you don't support the actual overtime protections and rights that farm workers deserve? And so that's what I will be writing about. I'll be writing about the shared history and power that connects the Latino community with the Black community, and really examining that exclusionary labor law that we still currently have in today's in a lot of our different states, and here in Oregon too, where farm workers aren't paid overtime.
Right. And so the fact that this exclusion has existed since 1938 and that people don't know about it, it sort of speaks to this. People forget the wrongs that have been committed, and it's our job to remind people. So thank you for what you're doing, Martha. And you started touching on this a little bit in your first response about the importance of telling our authentic stories and ensuring that they're being heard. And you've shared a piece already with the community. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the piece that you've published, and similarly, what drew you to this, and where else are you going with your writing for this fellowship?
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Well, I just wanted to also say, I think it's such a powerful space we're in with women of color, rural women writers. I've done writing classes in the past before, and it's majority white. And sometimes when you're sharing a very vulnerable experience, you can regret that moment instantly. And I just want to say that in the spaces that we were in, I felt safe and I felt empowered, uplifted by my comrades here. And I think that's why this fellowship was so calling to me at the very beginning, and it lives true to that. Yeah, the first piece was on meatpacking plant community, our meatpacking plant community here in the Southwest area. And the reason I wrote that story actually was because I was hearing racist remarks, just comments about people that didn't understand really the stories of people that were going through really hard times. And I wanted to kind of like bust it and crush on those kind of myths and thoughts they had. And I thought it was so powerful as someone who had first person experience breathing in a plant, but also throughout my life, I've heard my parents talk about this. So I'm really trying to be a myth buster here and changing and shifting the narrative of rural America and the workers of rural America, which are dominantly immigrants, Latinx, Asian, African-American, African immigrants. And so to me, it was just really important to bring up race, to bring up labor that is being done, the economic development, and just the fact that these are community members and we should really be opening our hands and arms to support them better. And it turned out to be a very op-ed, like asking our Congress and our even local and state representatives to be, hey, bring these people into your space because you need to listen to their stories about what's happening inside that you might not hear from the president of the company or someone in HR. So I'm just very close to the people that do work and you know, I just really want to elevate those voices. And yeah, I think back that shift, the narrative of rural America, I'm really passionate about kind of talking about Worthington in particular. And so I'm hoping in the next piece that I just pitched, we'll focus on rural young people of color. So I'm really excited to be talking to students who are still within the school district or who have recently graduated to talk about their experiences of what it's like to live in a minority majority community. To talk about, you know, yeah, this is rural America, white supremacy exists here. People who are racist live here, but that's not all of us. And here are the things that we're doing to create and foster inclusive community work. Yeah, I think oftentimes folks outside of our communities think they're not doing anything and they're just gonna continue to foster this kind of very homogenous, monolithic, white narrative or, you know, the people who really live here. And so I'm just looking forward to being able to tell, you know, the work that's being done to change and progress our own community, but also the fact that Worthington isn't like the fact that there are other surrounding rural communities that are turning and becoming like Worthington. And I think it'd be a great example for me to tell in case there are other communities who are in need of these answers as well, and what's happening and what can we do better to support our communities of color, but also our youth.
Thank you. And you know, the timing for your piece when it was published, we didn't know this was going to happen, but the universe brought us a really special opportunity, which was that within days after Andrea's piece was published, there was actually a special hearing in Congress on the treatment of meatpackers during this COVID crisis. And so your piece really informed the public about some of the reality of those workers. So thank you for that. And I know that it had a real impact. All right, so the work we're doing here is big. I believe that we will save democracy from rural America. And I believe that we have a real chance to change things forever through our collective energy and work. And we've spoken here about some of the work we're doing individually, but let's spend some time thinking about and talking about how we, amongst this group and sort of the branches that we're putting out in our communities through this fellowship, how are we going to build the bridges that are necessary? How is the bridge building happening already? And what do you see as the opportunities going forward? I'll let you decide who wants to kick it off. I won't assign this one to anyone.
I'll go. So, right now through my organization, NACA Inspired Schools Network, we are engaging in an anti-bias, anti-racism training. And it's through a Montessori model. And earlier I spoke to the idea about our solidarity and liberation being connected with one another. And, throughout the years that I've engaged in the community organizing work that I do, I see that more than ever. And I'm so happy for it. Here in New Mexico, we're working to create spaces to have discourse around, advocating for BLM and Red Nation, as well as our undocumented families. We have a bill right now in the legislative session calling for a moratorium on signing further contracts with private prisons, which also incarcerate our undocumented relatives on tribal lands. And we know that all of our communities have to pull together, to fight for all of our liberation. And so I'm actually very heartened that change is coming and change is here, and what they say about the revolution not being televised. I don't know if I agree with that anymore, because of the media outlets now that, that we have control of, that we are dictating, that we are, placing our narratives in. Maybe social media might be a double-edged sword, but nowadays we know that we can get information out quicker and more immediate than waiting for these, top-down media outlets to do it for us. And then also skewing the truth. So we are in control of our own narratives. And not only are we in control of our own narratives, but we also know because these stories, it's a floodgate being open, about our resiliency and our resistance and our revolution against all these systemic oppressions. We see ourselves in each other through these stories. And that's where I think that solidarity for all of our hard fought for liberation is happening at such a pace now that, those who would like for it to be otherwise, they don't have a say so in it any longer. And that's, again, just going back to the idea of and the power of taking back our ability to tell our own stories and telling them in chorus, in concert with one another. And so, yeah, those are just some of the things that I get to witness and get to participate, play witness to, here in New Mexico, that is directly related to all of our relatives across the country, across Turtle Island and globally as well.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to share?
I'll go. Yeah, no, I'm with Jessica 100% in full agreement of how we see one another in each other's stories. I think it's so crucial to be able to, first of all, have access to these stories in our different languages, because that's just so powerful. And it really, it helps us kind of to better understand our differences that are still exactly the same as our similarities. And that really helps us be in solidarity with one another. I think obviously there's still so much education to be done with, like, I'll just speak on my behalf in the work that I do in the Latinx community. There's so much like anti-Black or like racism that occurs there that needs to be educated, yet telling them, it's so important for us to understand their experiences and listen to one another, to be able to be in solidarity with them so we can all fight together and progress well for all of our futures and for the future generations to come. So I really think bridging means being able to really listen, read, be mindful, and love radically, just be there and for our people. And yeah, learning that being with one another, it doesn't have to be obviously like hand in hand, but just really being in one another and seeing one another in each other's stories is really powerful and important for our liberation in a sense.
Thank you. And actually, I do want to call on you because you run one of the oldest, most revered institutions in our country that has been building bridges for so long. Share a little bit about your work.
When the new world does open up, like, I expect that the incredible work of the organization that brought us all together in the first place will continue to do the work to bring us together, in collaboration with all the organizations represented in the fellowship, including the Highlander Center, And that we'll get to tell our stories sitting in rocking chairs around, around a fire somewhere, and get to celebrate the incredible writing that all of these folks and myself are doing, and celebrate, the work of all of our other sisters in this broad network of rural women that are literally putting their everything into saving the world. And so I feel most excited about like the literal relationships that, these people have told me stories, and I've told them stories that no one else really knows about us as movement leaders. So they're stuck with me. We go together now. That's the first bridge, is like we've built a kinship. And I think we're all committed to continuing to see that ripple out and benefit the world in a lot of different personal and political ways. Second thing that I would say in terms of Highlanders work, to your point, is like we've been bringing people together across difference since 1932, with all sorts of implications, right? Both implications that were positive towards movement building and infrastructure building. We've been a catalyst for social movements in the South and the country and internationally, where everybody's a teacher, everybody's a learner. We take that new knowledge that could only exist if we came together across our differences to share story, to share narrative, to express culture, etc., to share skill sets. If we take that new knowledge and we actually go home and we do something with that new knowledge, we could change our material conditions ourselves as the most directly impacted people. That's what Highlanders been doing since 1932. Those good implications are really, really fun and sexy to talk about. The other implications weren't so fun, like the state working with white supremacists and law enforcement to try to shut us down multiple times over our almost 90 years of being in existence, which isn't just an attack on Highlander, right? We're coming up on the anniversary of the last white supremacist attack on the Highlander Center back in 2019, when white nationalists burned down our administrative offices. That's scary and unfortunate. But what's even more infuriating is that it's an attack on movement infrastructure that is about Black leadership, is about Latinx leadership development, is about having lifelong relationships with other BIPOC communities, cash poor folks that are living, again, on the margins of the margins. And so I think why this matters to me, particularly in my identity as a rural woman and the first Black woman executive director of the center in this 90 years of experience and history, is that, Highlander in and of itself is special. The magic juju, the magic sauce is actually rooted in the fact that we are place-based, right? We are country folks. We were born in the mountains, right? Like that's actually a part of our ethos, right? The way that we express our understanding of strategies that change people's material conditions are rooted in our understanding of what it means to be rural. It just is. And it doesn't make any other place not great. There's a lot of other people doing a lot of other political education, popular education, practicing these methodologies, right? But what makes us special is that we do it based on where we're from and the time, place, and conditions that we inherited. So what's our commitment to bridge building? We're going to keep on doing what we've been doing, trying to bring people together to figure shit out since 1932. That's what we're going to keep doing. I think that if there was ever a time, y'all, if there was ever a time to be building these kinds of bridges, it's now. And I think even more importantly to me than that, because we saw it win, right? We saw it win across tactical intervention, right? To Martha's incredible work building and popularizing electoral organizing on the left, right? Towards the electoral justice work that we saw shift Georgia and save the country from a second term of the Trump administration. What we saw in organizing and base building and policy, right? Biden didn't give us those executive orders because he's just a good person. He gave it to us because he politically had no choice, because we built the conditions through multiple tactics and through the bridges of our relationships to make it so. And so if there was ever a time, not just because of the crisis, but because of the deliciousness of what it means to build multiracial cross-sector movements, it's right now. I think that the period on the sentence for me is that it feels good to win. That's the only way to do it. And if we want to actually see in fruition the beloved community that I think all of our organizations are saying, like solidarity is a reciprocal practice. that neoliberalism stuff and thinking that we can just take a deep breath because we got Trump out of office is clearly not the case. We've seen more deportations, particularly of undocumented Black people. And so there's much more work to be done. And I truly don't know that we could win without the leadership of Rule 1.
Thank you. And here. And I wanna close this point by bringing Martha in, because we are still in this pandemic. We know that among the frontline workers who have held this nation up and kept this country going, it has been BIPOC people. There have been many people in rural America who are among those who have gotten sick, who have passed away. And the reality for people in this country and around the world is that we spend more hours of our day working than in any other activity. And so what is the role of labor, formal and informal, the labor movement, in helping to continue to build bridges, but inclusive bridges? Because let's be honest about the labor movement in our country. The history has not always been one that reflects an inclusive movement. So Martha, where are we going? How do we do that for the future?
Right now, what we need, right, in terms here in Oregon specifically, right, when talking about this overtime campaign, is we need them to show up, and we need them to show up for us and to put their political, power to work for us, to put their voices, their bodies up for us as well, because we are taking a lot. I think a lot of the campaigns that we all probably work on take on a huge toll on all of us, both emotionally, spiritually, even physically. And so I think it's important for the labor movement to show up for us and to follow our lead, is more than anything, is to follow our lead, follow what we tell them to do, and I think and really stay strong there, not going back and forth. I think that's what we need. And I think I also just wanted to add that, once again, emphasize what Jessica brought up around our shared liberation and solidarity. And I do think that there's a lot of work within the Latino community around anti-Blackness. And I think, and we are, it's important that, as a member of the Latino community, that I have conversations about that with my community, and that I also hold people accountable, because we gotta show up for each other.
I am sad because our time is running out, and it has been a huge gift for me to get to spend time with you. It has been a huge gift to all of us that when we put out the call and said we have this vision of building something that we know is important and we believe will make a difference, we want to record our history, we want you to do it with us, you all said yes. And so we thank you for saying yes and for continuing to tell the stories that need to be told, and helping to mark history by doing so. This is Women's History Month. We are having this conversation to celebrate Women's History Month and women's contributions, rural women in particular, through this conversation. And you each inspire me. But I would love to leave our audience with a word from each of you about who the women are who inspire you. So let's start with Andrea.
100% women like my mother.
Thank you. Ashley.
Think about the women on this call. I think about Norma, because this fellowship wouldn't have happened without her. I jokingly, all of us really, jokingly and kind of seriously, always talked about Norma as like the extra member of our cohort, so I'm grateful for Norma. Both her service and her political clarity in that space was always so useful. I also think about my family, my mom, my grandmother, who was a domestic worker. She would have called herself a maid on Lookout Mountain of Tennessee, the Lookout Mountain that Martin Luther King talks about in the I Have a Dream speech. And that her daughter, the youngest of 5, was a member of the Black Panther Party. And now her granddaughter is the first Black woman executive director of the historic Highlander Center. Just makes me know that a new world is possible because of the brilliance of everyday Black people.
Thank you, Ashley. Jessica.
Well, I'd like to call in this circle Representative Deborah Holland, soon to be our Secretary of Interior, who hails from Laguna, pueblo here in New Mexico, as well as Gloria M. Lopez, my mama, and my daughter, Mia Sopapia. And there's so many more, bevy. I could just run through lists forever. We'll be here for days. All of us will be here for days. All of us. But just all the shoulders that, we build upon, and including, the women behind this fellowship. Appreciate you.
Thank you. And Marta.
The one person that comes to mind is my mom as well, who's really shown up for me in a lot of different ways throughout my life, and I think in huge ways in the last couple of months. So I just, I love her, and she is my inspiration.
Thank you all. And thank you for being an inspiration to all of us. For those of you who have joined us, thank you so much for being here. Rural women of color live across our country. We've always lived in our communities. We have always led in our communities, and we will continue to lead in and for our communities. We aren't going anywhere. And as Andrea called on us to do, we will continue to love radically. Thank you all.